All right, so just before I begin, I would like to state for the record that today is October 23rd, 2020, and my name is Ben Bauman, and I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm speaking via phone with John Mutz, who is in Indianapolis, Indiana as well. Is that correct?
I confirm what you just said,
And we are doing an interview for the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. So just starting off, I'll ask a few basic questions about your background. When and where were you born?
I was born November 5th, 1935, which makes me 84 at this moment. I was born here in Indianapolis in the Methodist Hospital.
Okay. And what were your parents' names?
My father's name was John L. Mutz. The L stood for Lowry, L-O-U-G-H-E-R-Y, and my mother's name was Mary Helen Massey, M-A-S-S-I-E.
Excellent, okay. And how long had your family been in Indiana?
Well, the Mutzes first came to Edinburgh, Indiana, I think around 1890.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So, family's been here for a while then?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what were your parents' occupations?
Well, my mother was a school teacher. She taught I think it's the 3rd and 4th grade. And my father was a certified public accountant. At one time, the vice president and treasurer of the Barbasol shaving cream company.
Oh, okay.
Here in Indianapolis. Later, he became the chief financial officer for Warren Atkinson, who was an extremely well-known land developer in Indianapolis. Most famous for his developments around the reservoirs, which were developed by the Indianapolis Water Company at the time to provide potable drinking water for the city.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Now, do you have any siblings?
I have no siblings. I'm an only child.
Okay. So how would you describe your childhood growing up?
Well, my childhood growing up took place on the north side of Indianapolis. I largely lived in 2 locations, and during my early school years, I attended public school 84 at 57th and Central in Indianapolis. I lived at 5725 Winthrop until I was in the 3rd grade, and then my folks bought a new house on North Meridian Street at 57th and Meridian. People today know it as what looks like a large farmhouse. And as a matter of fact, it was the original farmhouse in the area that was later developed and carved up into lots. It's across the street from the Meridian Restaurant, which is a well-known landmark on the north side of Indianapolis.
Oh, okay. That's neat. Who were the most influential people in your childhood?
Well, without doubt, my parents to begin with.
Right.
I would have to say that both of them were extremely well-read. They were voracious readers. My mother particularly on fiction and my father on history. Our dinner table conversations were, in my mind, educational.
Oh, okay.
My father had a rule that at 6 p.m., that was dinner time in the Mutz household, and everybody was expected to be there, even though everybody was just 3 of us.
Right.
And the dinner table conversations largely revolved around the things that my mother and father had read during the week, and we discussed everything from religion to history, culture, race relations, you name it. It may be one of the most important learning periods in my life. I'm sure I learned more at the dinner table than I did at Public School 84.
Yeah.
That's the background in which I grew up. Now, there were other people who became very important. I would say at Public School 84, I would mention two teachers in particular. One was Esther Coffing, Coffing, who was my teacher in the 4th grade, and she was I think, the classic example of a teacher at that time. She was well educated, articulate. She had the most beautiful handwriting you have ever seen, and she was a rigorous teacher. It was not unusual for her to say on my papers, Johnny, that's what they called me back then, Johnnny, Johnny, you can do better. She said that over and over again. Later on, I had a chance to visit with her when she was in her late 90s, living in a teacher's retirement facility in Franklin, Indiana. And I told her the story about what she wrote on my papers. And she said, well, Johnny, now you have. And I guess it was a very emotional moment for me. I know it was an emotional moment for me.
Sure, yeah.
I had another teacher at Public School 84 named Dorothea Galley, Galley. She taught gym and a variety of other things on the curriculum for the 7th and 8th grade. Miss Galley recognized my emotional desire to succeed at athletics, and she also realized my limitations. And back in those days, of course, everybody wanted to be a basketball player, a basketball star, if you will. And my father had been when he was at Edinburgh High School. In fact, he was the leading scorer on the team, largely because in those days they had a designated foul shot shooter.
Okay.
He got all the team's foul shots, and as a result, he was the leading scorer. But that's beside the point. What I'd say is that Miss Galley talked to me one day when I was in the 7th grade, and she said, Johnny, you're not very big. You have better than average athletic ability, but you may not be as good as you'd like to be, and I suggest you buy a tennis racket.
Huh.
And I already owned a tennis racket, but I hadn't played with it much. I did start playing tennis partly in response to her suggestion, and I played at the Riviera Club, which was walking distance from our home, and never took any lessons there, but I watched the pro give lessons to other people and then attempted to emulate what he had told them to do. And through a number of unusual events, I became the number 1 player on the Broad Ripple High School tennis team.
Wow.
And then I went to Northwestern University and was encouraged, I'd say almost forced, by my fraternity to play in the intramural tournament at Northwestern my freshman year. I won the intramural tournament, and the tennis coach invited me to come out for the team. And so I did, and later I played tennis for Northwestern. So that was a kind of a positive statement which reinforces what Miss Galley suggested that I do.
Yeah.
Those are some of those historic things. The quality of teachers at Public School 84 and at Broad Ripple High School was astounding at that time period. Extremely well read, well educated, and committed to their work. I have to say that the environment was very conducive to I think, a quality liberal education.
Yeah, that makes sense. Huh, that's really cool. Now, you talked a lot about those sort of family dinners with your parents. Did you learn a fair amount about your family's political beliefs as a child from those dinners?
Oh, yes. My father was had a lot to say about political world, and he pointed out that he came from a family in Johnson County, Indiana, the Mutz family, in which most of the men were Democrats. They were the brand of Democrat which people fondly called Southern Indiana conservative Democrats, but nevertheless Democrats. He admitted to voting for FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, twice, and then moving to the Republican Party when Roosevelt ran for a third term.
Okay.
He, of course, at the time was advancing rapidly in the business community, and I suppose that the colleagues that he ran into and talked to largely were Republicans at that time that may have influenced his ideas. But I think more than anything else, he recognized that the Roosevelt administration was the first administration to really produce examples of what we today call big federal government.
Yeah.
Major programs, social welfare programs, and he saw a danger in that it drove up the federal deficit, that it took more of the resources of society out of the private sector and put those resources into the public sector. And he felt that the private sector was the best creator of jobs and wealth, and that part of the goal should be to maximize the amount of resources in that private sector. We had long conversations about the economics of government spending at the federal level. Did not say a whole lot at that time about Indiana's spending as a state, but at the federal level we talked a lot about it. Other subjects that we talked about, for example, included race relations. And, of course, at that juncture in my life, that was not an issue that I had very much experience with. Quite candidly, the only African-American people I knew were domestic employees who worked at our home on the north side of Indianapolis.
Okay.
And, of course, I got to know them well and liked them. And they certainly were nice to me as I grew up. But nevertheless, the fact is that I didn't know very many African Americans. In fact, at Broderville High School, there was only one in my graduating class.
Wow.
Now, you have to realize that we were coming off that moment of separate but equal in the education system.
Yeah.
And we had an all African American high school in Indianapolis called Crispus Attucks, named after one of the heroes of the Boston Tea Party, and it was, of course, well known at that time for its basketball teams, etc. But it was a segregated school system, and the integration was just beginning at that time. It was after Brown versus Board of Education, and important moment. We talked a lot about the African American community, and there were some remnants of bias in the minds of my mother and father at that time. Although I never heard any derogatory words about the African American community, and I also saw them feeling like they had an obligation to help people who had less resources than they did. And so there are at least 2 African American families who worked at the Barbasol Company, who were the beneficiaries, I guess you'd call it, of gifts from my mother and dad. And I remember spending time with my dad when we went down to the plant, that is the factory at 10th and Senate Avenue, and he said, there are times when we need to share the resources we have with other people who have less than we do. And he said, that's what we're going to do today. And then we went and visited with one of the people that he worked with.
Wow.
So that's kind of the background. My dad also, I remember one day at dinner, said, you won't believe what I did today. And of course he said, what I did was I spent the entire day volunteering for the United Way in Indianapolis. And what we were doing was evaluating requests for funding from the United Way. And of course I didn't even know what the United Way was at that point. He described how it worked. And of course his comment was, if there wasn't a United Way, the business community would need to invent it. And so my introduction to philanthropy, if you want to call it that, or giving, it came from him and from the dinner table. During that same time period, a little later, I was working on the copy desk of the Indianapolis News in a summer job. And it was the year in which the Kinsey Report was first released from Indiana University. And people at the News and Star couldn't wait to get to the wire machines to see what the latest installment was on the Kinsey Report. As you might guess, it was a revolutionary concept and disclosed all kinds of information about American people, which nobody even talked about, let alone read about in the paper. And so that particular event evoked a number of conversations at the dinner table. As I said, it was a liberal education.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. So now, growing up, you were obviously, as a kid, World War II was going on. What was it like?
Well, I lived in a family where my father, I guess fortunately, was called for physicals and rejected a couple of times. And so he was classified under the Selective Service Administration as 4F. And 4F meant you were not eligible to serve and didn't have to serve. And so he did not serve during the Second World War. He did become an air raid warden and was responsible for 1/2 of the city of Indianapolis. He supervised the system for the protection of the population against a potential raid. Of course, that never happened. But he had a white hat, a big white hat he wore, and a bunch of other stuff that was part of this. And during that time period, we had what were called blackouts and brownouts. And those were practice sessions for air raids.
Wow.
And for a certain period of time, everybody was supposed to turn off all their lights so that a potential enemy couldn't see where to drop their bombs. And we were advised to hole up in our homes in a room without windows. And the tradition at our house during those air raids was for my father to go out and make his rounds to make sure all the lights were out, which he did. And then when he came home, we sat in a darkened room in the middle of the house we lived in on Winthrop, and listened to FDR deliver one of his fireside chats. He was famous for this method of communication with the population, and I will never forget the sound of his voice. He was a dominant political factor, and he obviously made a big impression on me and on the population of America, since, of course, he was elected to 4 terms.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what was it like for your parents to try to, or I guess for you, what was it like, hearing about the war? Did you talk about the war with your parents? Did they explain to you what was happening and, or talk to you about the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, or?
Yes, my father was the first person to explain to me that Adolf Hitler had come to office through an election. He was actually popularly elected to office.
Right.
And then, of course, he assumed his dominant role in the kind of philosophy that was anti-Jewish and, in many cases, anti-Catholic as well. The Holocaust was not well known at that time, so we didn't talk much about that. And I doubt if we ever talked about it. Maybe what I know about is what I've learned since then. But at any rate, the other thing, of course, that we talked about was the war itself. And we had rationing in effect. First of all, gasoline was rationed. And so you had a designation for your usage of gasoline, and it was A, B, C, and D, I think. And if you were A, you had a lot more gasoline than other people did because you had some kind of essential role to play in society. It limited the mobility of our family. Our family vacations took place in the state of Indiana at state parks rather than traveling around the country as we had done previously. My father was really big on travel to Canada, travel to national parks and all that sort of thing, which we didn't do during the war. Food was rationed during that time period. It was very clear that we were in a war. Society knew it. And I have never seen a time in my life when the country was more united around a goal. That goal, of course, was to defeat Adolf Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and the Emperor in Japan.
Right.
And as a boy, I had a dartboard with pictures of these 3 people on it. I periodically was supposed to throw darts at it. I'm not sure I did that much, but I remember the dartboard. The government did a pretty good job of spreading the word and bringing the general population into the war effort. A number of members of my family were in the war effort. I had a cousin named Frank Mutz, who was also from Edinburgh, Indiana. He'd be a cousin of my father's, and he was a nationally honored pilot of the P-38 fighter plane. And he shot down numerous enemy planes, notably in the Pacific Theater, where he was fighting the Japanese Zero. So it was the P-38 versus the Zero. It was not, on a few occasions, I remember seeing stories in the paper about his success and also about his downing when he was shot down and later was rescued. So he was a genuine hero in the Second World War. And there were others that we knew about, but the actual danger of death really never quite touched our family like it did others.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Definitely a really wild time to be alive. And then, I guess, shortly after World War II, then the Cold War opens up, and you got to really see a lot, I guess.
Yeah, the Cold War did open up I don't remember my father talking too much about the Cold War.
Yeah.
I do remember him talking about the fact that the Great Depression and the recession that occurred before the Second World War ended, he said, largely because of the war. The economy was accelerated. Many businesses operated 24 hours a day, as did his. You may wonder why shaving cream would be so essential, but there was a small tube of Barbasol in every pack that was used by our army in the field.
Wow.
So Barbasol was a name well known, largely because it was the brand of choice at that moment. So I guess what I remember most about the post-war era was the recovery of the U.S. economy, the increase in manufacturing, the movement of soldiers who came back under the GI Bill. And so what happened, of course, was that the percent of the population that had college experience dramatically changed after the war.
Yeah.
And the GI Bill turned out to be one of the great moments in education history. It was not unusual to go to Indiana University, where my mother and father went, and see Quonset hut after Quonset hut that were built to house more students on those campuses. And even when I went to Northwestern University, I still had in the school a handful, maybe more than a handful, of veterans who were studying under the GI Bill. They were much more mature than the rest of us. Many of them married, and education was a serious matter. When it came time to study, you better be quiet, or one of them would box your ears. So it was a moment in which the GI Bill became a big factor in American life. Education became a bigger factor, and manufacturing accelerated. Now, with manufacturing, incomes of middle America grew, and this made it possible for people to buy houses. And the starter house was a phenomena. By that I mean, of course, the first house that a family has became a big deal. And I remember my father talking a lot about the housing developments near New York City, where mass home construction was first taking place.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Now, talking about your sort of education growing up, what schools did you attend?
Well, of course, I went to kindergarten, but that was about my grades 1 through 8 were at public school, 84 in Indianapolis.
Okay.
And then I went to Broad Ripple High School.
Right. Okay. That's right. And
then I went to Northwestern University. I got both a bachelor's and a master's degree from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Now, when you were in school, did you have any favorite subjects?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. Well, I enjoyed the writing courses that I took at Northwestern, but of course they were mandatory in the journalism school.
Yeah.
And enjoy is not the right word. I guess I'd have to say it dominated that part of my education. The Medill School prided itself on turning out good writers, and the emphasis was on the quality of your writing, the ability to explain a complicated matter in simple terms, a whole lot of things like that. So, yeah, that was a dominant influence. The other thing I guess I would say about my experience at Northwestern, it began an involvement in the political realm in that I was involved in student government there, representative of the student governing board for my class, 2 of the 4 years I was in school. I was a candidate for president of the student body, but lost that election by 7 votes. We had in Northwestern 2 political parties. They were not Democrats and Republicans. They were the Student Congress, which I was a member of, and maybe a little conservative, and Federation of Northwestern Voters, which was the other party. All of this was set up in an effort to give students an idea about how political parties function, what they do, how they achieve success, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Now, another thing I was curious about, did you have any views about the state of Indiana or about being a Hoosier growing up and also then going on to college?
Well, of course, I had views. They're largely a result of my father and mother.
Yeah.
Back in those days, basketball was king, and so everybody talked about it, and my father and I went to many basketball games and baseball games, and we were fans of the Indianapolis Indians.
Oh, okay.
Who played out on 16th Street here in Indianapolis. And my father and I went to lots of Indians games. But my mother was not much on baseball, so she didn't go with us. But the high school basketball tournament was a really big event in Indiana in those days. As you probably know, there was one class, single class basketball, and it's the era in which the little town of Milan became famous.
Right.
Later made the movie Hoosiers about it, even though the name Milan doesn't appear in the Hoosiers movie.
Yeah.
It was also the era of Chris Besadic's ascendancy into high school basketball, and Chris Besadic's actually won 2 state championships during that time period. First time an Indianapolis school had ever won. And we saw the development of some of the men at Attucks who would become really icons in basketball, the most famous one being Oscar Robertson.
Right.
Played here in Indianapolis. I actually knew Oscar. I mean, I haven't seen him for a long time, but I did some business with him after this time period. But at any rate, this was the era of the George McGinnis, who played for Washington High School. And of course, one of the big deals was just before I went to Broad Ripple, Coach Frank Baird took the Rockets to the afternoon game of the state finals. And that was really a big deal. And it was thought about the possibility that Broad Ripple might become the first school in Indianapolis to win the tournament. They didn't. Of course, Attucks came along later. But that was all part of the environment, the culture at that point.
Yeah, that's neat. Absolutely. So when you got to college now, did your understanding or awareness of politics change at all, or?
Well, yes, it did. One of the reasons for that was that Adlai Stevenson, who was U.S. Senator from Illinois, was a Northwestern graduate and was on campus to speak periodically. And so, of course, he's a Democrat. I'm a Republican, so went to hear him speak. We had a student activity in which we created our version of a national political convention. And we nominated candidates and voted on them and all that sort of thing. And the various housing units, fraternities, sororities, and independent housing units had delegations to the convention, in essence. And so that was an opportunity to learn about the national convention process and, of course, the role of political parties. Meanwhile, back at home, when I was home, my parents were talking about Indiana politics. And the ascendancy of certain people who might become quite successful. And my mother in particular was well aware of the fact that a president could in fact do their best to eliminate an opponent by appointing that opponent to an ambassadorship. And that's exactly what happened during that time period. Kind of an interesting story. But at any rate, the point I make is that what we see today on the part of Donald Trump to discredit his opponent, rather than to talk about what he was going to do or how he was going to do it, that was a subtle way of doing that back in those days.
Okay, interesting. So that's a kind of I guess a typical political strategy historically. But
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, this is the era of Schricker as governor, later Harold Hanley as governor. I guess I'd have to say Indiana at that time bounced back and forth. It was not, quote, a red state all the time. You had Democratic governors and Republicans.
Yeah.
And we also had a single term limit, so you couldn't succeed yourself. Now, Henry Schricker did succeed himself, but what he did was he laid out for 4 years and then ran again and was elected the second time. So he did actually serve two terms.
Yeah, okay. Now, after college, after you graduated from Northwestern, what was your first job?
Okay, well, I think I mentioned to you earlier that I had been working summers on the copy desk of the Indianapolis News.
Okay.
On other summers, I worked in the public relations department at the Allison Division of General Motors here in Indianapolis. I also worked as the publicity director for the Indiana State Fair and publicity director for Starlight Musicals, which was a summer musical series of professional singers and dancers who performed on a stage built on the north end of the Butler Bowl, the place where Butler played football.
Okay.
So those are jobs I had. But my first real job out of college was on the at Alcoa, the Aluminum Company of America in Pittsburgh, where I worked in the public relations department.
Okay.
I wrote news releases and wrote speeches for executives and things of that kind.
Interesting. Now, what were your career aspirations?
Well, when I first got to college, I guess I saw myself as the man in the gray flannel suit. You know, the guy who entered employment at a large company, succeeded, and later became an officer of that company. Now, I would have to say that after my 2.5-year stint at Alcoa, I then realized that life was not for me. That was not something that turned me on. I decided that I needed to come back to Indianapolis. Part of that was due to the fact that my mother died at a young age. She was in her 50s, early 50s, and so I was back to see my father periodically.
Oh, okay.
And coming back to Indianapolis was a bigger deal than it is now to Pittsburgh. Usually had to drive because I couldn't afford the airplane fares. But the point I make is that the circumstances were that I had kind of decided that I wanted to run for office someday. And I felt that I could do a better job running for office in my hometown, Indianapolis, than I could do in Pittsburgh, even though I was active in the Young Republicans in Pittsburgh and actually at one time chairman of the Allegheny County Young Republicans, which is the county in which the city of Pittsburgh is located.
Mm-hmm.
And I was volunteering for a Republican congressman who represented part of the suburban Pittsburgh area named Bob Corbett. and he invited me to join his staff, and that would have involved moving, at least in part, to Washington. Carolyn, my wife, and I were expecting our first child at that point. My mother had died. All those things happened, and so our final decision was that we moved back to Indianapolis, and so that's what we did.
Okay, interesting. Now, when did you get married?
Well, we were married on June the 21st, 1958.
Okay. And how many children do you have?
We have two children, Mark and Diana.
Okay. So how much influence did your wife and children have on the development of your career?
Well, they had a lot of influence. My wife in particular is one of the greatest enablers that I've seen over my lifetime. We've now been married as we speak here for 62 years. So
wow.
We've been together a long time. She not only was a good teacher, but she also was an enabler in a lot of ways. She edited my speeches. She edited things I wrote and so forth. We had a lot of interplay. And the other thing, of course, you may not know about, but during my childhood and period during high school, I had a severe stutter.
Okay.
It's the same situation that Joe Biden has here right now. And I do remember having some speech therapy when I was in the 3rd and 4th grade at public school at 84. I remember kids laughing at me when I stuttered. And you may find it to be a pretty astounding decision for somebody who stuttered to try to become a politician where your major method of getting elected was your ability to speak, to be heard, and to explain yourself. And so, but I did. My wife never corrected me, never finished sentences for me. I think she was kind of surprised and amazed that I did this.
Yeah.
But I would have to say to you that I found the more I spoke, the better I got at it, the more I was able to deal with my stutter. I still stutter today, on and off, not much, but it was a real challenge.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it definitely sounds like all the effort paid off quite a bit. Yeah, you seem like a pretty crisp and clear speaker, so.
Well, I appreciate that. It was a big effort.
Yeah, your voice actually kind of reminds me of like a sports broadcaster or something. So.
Well, I'm told I sounded like Jimmy Stewart.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And of course, he's deceased now, I think. But
yeah.
I probably did. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So when you first decided to get involved in like running for politics, what shaped your political outlook?
Well, I don't think I understand what you mean. How did I get involved or what?
No, so like once you decide, okay, I'm gonna run, what were kind of the major ideas that were shaping what type of politician you wanted to be?
Oh, okay. Well, again, I think we have to go back and historically look what was going on in Marion County.
Yeah.
And I was a volunteer, as I told you, for the congressman in suburban Pittsburgh. And so when I came to Indianapolis, I volunteered again. And I went in to see the then Republican county chairman, Dale Brown. Mm-hmm. And his major comment to me was, have you got any money?
Okay.
In other words, which I didn't, of course, but that was not what I was looking for. I was looking for a chance to participate. He was not encouraging. It was not a good scene. And
okay.
So I decided to form my own little political party, and I founded an organization called the North Side Political Action Club. And this was a group of contemporary couples primarily, of Carolyn and mine. We met monthly. We had speakers who were all politicians. We were committed to the Republican side of the spectrum, and included in our group are a number of people who have gone on to be successful, including Bill Ruckelshaus, who was famous for the Saturday Night Massacre. It included Ned Lampkin, who was later majority leader of the Indiana General Assembly, and several others. But at any rate, that was my start.
Yeah.
Now, the idea was that if you had some people who volunteered and did things in politics, that the county organization would take notice of and give you a chance. Well, that didn't happen. And so I became part of the Republican Action Committee. The Republican Action Committee was a group of idealistic young men and women, mostly in their late 20s and early 30s, and a small group of Republican office holders in Marion County. And we basically said, we can do better. And it was our conviction that Dale Brown was more interested in maintaining control in his position and the patronage that he had available to him through the license branch system and through the 2% Club. He was more interested in keeping those sources of income than he was in electing Republicans.
Yeah.
And so we organized and created the Republican Action Committee. The Republican office holders suggested and actually voted to get Keith Bulen to lead that effort, which he did. And there's an enormous amount of history that follows. Now, it's interesting you're asking these questions because all that I've described to you, most of it anyway, is in my new book that came out 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
It was published by the Indiana Historical Society,
Mm-hmm.
and its title is An Examined Life, the John Mutz story. And of course, an examined life comes from that quotation about an examined life is worth living, and an unexamined life is not worth living, etc., attributed to Socrates. So anyway, that's that whole story that I just described is in the book, as well as some of the childhood events that you asked about.
Yeah, that's cool. All right. Well, I'm sure that's a great resource for people that want to dive deeper then on some of these questions. That's great. So you mentioned that you sort of got involved in politics in Indiana as being part of that action committee. Were there any key issues or legislation that you really wanted to champion or fight against?
What we were interested in was making Indianapolis a more important city, a better place to live.
Yeah.
And we were tired of people calling Indianapolis a cornfield with lights and a place that people pass through on the way to somewhere else. The story was that Kurt Vonnegut, the author, said that Indianapolis is a sleepy city. They watch a race one day a year and sleep the other 364.
Okay.
Not sure he actually said that, but it certainly is appeared in a lot of places. So we wanted to see Indianapolis do better. Now, what were the things we cared most about? Well, the number one was a higher quality of secondary of college education in Indianapolis. Up to that time, there were only extensions from Indiana and Purdue University in downtown Indianapolis. There was, of course, a campus that had the IU Law School, Medical School, and School of Dentistry in the University corridor on the northwest corner of the county. So our initial goal was to bring to Indianapolis a 4-year independent university with its own board of trustees and own state budget to serve the greater Indianapolis area. Dick Lugar had been elected mayor. The year before, I was elected in the legislature, and in an upset, he had beaten incumbent John Barton, and in an excerpt in the primary, he defeated former Mayor Alex Clark. And so what we did at this point was that we decided to create, quote, the University of Indianapolis. And we introduced bills to that effect. When I say we, I mean the 15-member Republican delegation from Indianapolis, which included, well, that was all House members, and then there were 4 Senate members. And the result of this was that, and if you read the book, you'll read the story of how we did this, how we got together, and among other things, we decided that you can't do this by yourself. You got to have support from someplace else. And so we delegated individuals in our delegation to go make friends with members of the legislature in other parts of the state. And our approach there was to ask them, well, what do you want from the legislature? And then we, of course, would have an opportunity to tell them what we wanted. So that was our approach.
Right. Okay. And I guess before you really got involved as a politician, did you have any state or local political heroes or people you looked up to?
Well, I can mention a few. One would be Bulen himself, who was a dynamic guy.
Right.
And a great leader. Another would probably be W.W. Dub Hill.
Okay.
He was a state senator, later head of the Public Service Commission, one of the brightest people I've ever met in the political realm. There were others, of course. I guess the ones I would think about were in Marion County primarily. One of them, of course, was my mother-in-law.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
My mother-in-law, Marcia Hawthorne, had been elected to the legislature for one term and then decided to run for recorder of Marion County. And she had lost her husband 4 or 5 years before, and this was a job that provided regular income to her and something that used her talents and skills, and so that's what she did. She served 2 terms as Marion County recorder. Interesting.
Okay.
Those would be examples of people. Dick Lugar, of course, was in the beginning of his career, and I would have to say that he and Bill Ruckelshaus were people who I admired tremendously. They both had an intellectual capacity and an ability to explain their ideas that was pretty exceptional.
Yeah, absolutely. So, did you have a particular campaign strategy when you were running?
Well, yeah, the strategy was to be part of the Republican Action Committee.
Yeah. Okay.
And elect the entire slate. And that's what we did. We had in the election of 1968 one of the most compelling victories maybe in Indiana election history.
Wow.
We elected a governor, Ed Whitcomb, from Seymour, Indiana. We elected a majority in the Indiana House and a majority in the Indiana Senate. We elected nearly all Marion County Republicans, including the city council and the county council. That's before Unigov. So you had both of those. So we had a lot of power.
Yeah.
The lines of political influence kind of lined up in an unusual way. And so one of the questions, of course, that we talked about, well, what do we do with all this power? How do we get it done? And that's what brought about the University of Indianapolis conversation. But what I didn't finish that conversation was that when we were meeting at John Burkhart's house on the west side of Indianapolis to talk about the University of Indianapolis legislation, that's when the idea of Unigov came up.
Yeah.
And we decided at that meeting that we would talk about how to bring unified government to Marion County. And during that time period, we also had time to study other consolidations of local government in the United States. And Dick Lugar was extremely well read on that subject, and I became better read on it as a result. One of the things that people forget is the really early consolidation took place in New York City, where the 5 boroughs were consolidated into New York City. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
And it was done legislatively, much how we were going to do it in Indianapolis.
Sure. Yeah, can you talk a bit more about your role in Unigov legislation then, and how?
Sure. I can tell you.
Yeah.
I was one of 8 people who were assembled at the Burkhardt House. John Burkhardt was I call him the godfather of the Action Committee. He helped finance it and stood behind us, behind the scenes. He was a prominent local businessman. He built the pyramids on the northwest corner of Marion County. He started the Indianapolis Business Journal and later started similar publications in other Midwestern cities. He was the founder of and creator of the College Life Insurance Company, quite successful. And so we met at the Burkhardt House. There were really 9 of us, and those people were, I'll start with 3 legislators. Larry Borsch, who was in the House then, later elected to the Senate. Ned Lampkin, in the House then, and later the majority leader of the House, and me. And I was in the House at that particular time. The others in the meeting were Dick Lugar, his deputy mayor, John Walls, the president of the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce, Carl Dortch, the president of the city council, Tom Hasbrook, and the president of the county council, Bert Servaz. We were later joined by 2 attorneys, Charles Whistler and Lou Bose, B-O-S-E, who did the bill drafting for us as we created our University of Indianapolis legislation and also the Unigov legislation.
Yeah, okay.
And so I guess I'd have to say, yes, I was involved in the development of the Unigov legislation and helped get it passed.
Yeah. And how hard was it to get that legislation passed?
Well, there's an entire chapter in my book devoted to that.
Okay.
and I don't think I'm going to go into all the details, except to say that we had to do a tremendous amount of compromising.
Yeah.
The bill originally had schools in it. That clearly could not be passed. This was an era of white flight from the old Indianapolis public school region into the suburbs.
Yeah.
That just wasn't going to happen, so we took the schools out. The township trustees turned out to be a real problem, so we took them out of the legislation. And we also took the cities of Speedway, Lawrence, and Beech Grove out of the legislation.
Yeah.
Who didn't want to be deprived of having their own mayor. But what we did, of course, was it granted the right to vote for the mayor to everybody in Marion County, included the people that lived in those three cities. So the problem with getting it passed, of course, was that in the legislature in Indiana, traditionally, it's always been the case where the outstate people always seem to be in competition within Indianapolis for resources and for influence. And so we made a big effort at recruiting Republicans and Democrats to this legislation. And a good example of this might be when I visited with a Bloomington legislator, newly elected just like I had been. And I said, well, what are you looking for from the next session? He said, it's easy. I want a 4-lane road from Indianapolis to Bloomington so people can easily get to football and basketball games. And I said, well, you'd have to have an increase in the gasoline tax to do that. He said, yes, I know. I'm prepared to support that and work on it. So there was an example of a kind of, you could call it a deal.
Yeah.
It was kind of how you build a coalition around your issue. And of course, I told him our goal was the University of Indianapolis and also the Unigov legislation.
Yeah, okay. So what would you say now, looking back at how Unigov has affected things, what would you say are the major changes that have been made as a result of that legislation?
Well, of course, first of all, it really put Indianapolis on the map in a different way. We became one of the 11 largest cities in the United States overnight. It suddenly became a very desirable role to be mayor of Indianapolis.
Yeah.
Dick Lugar was the first of those, I think, really highly qualified individuals who sought that job. He was followed by Hudnut, Goldsmith, can't name them all right this minute, but anyway, very, very competent people on both sides of the aisle who wanted to be mayor and who saw it as a great place to be of service, but also a stepping stone to something else.
Yeah.
So it made a big difference in the development of Indianapolis. At the same time, it also brought the Lilly endowment into the equation.
Okay.
The last of the three Lillys who founded Lilly Endowment were still alive, and they actually, that's Mr. Eli Lilly III, I guess it is, actually came to Dick Lugar and said, we've been investing our money all over the world, and we'd like now to concentrate on our hometown. What would you suggest we do? And so Dick's first suggestion was to finance improvements to the city market in downtown. This followed the bricking of the circle, the renovation of the Monument Circle, which of course was a state-owned property, but nevertheless a clear part of the image of Indianapolis. This was followed by substantial appropriations to what had become then IUPUI. So what I'd say is that the Unigov legislation, in my mind, was the turning point in the development of Indianapolis since Indianapolis was formed in 1816. I think it was that important.
Wow, okay. Now, were there any, would you say, sort of negative impacts of the legislation that you didn't really, see until later? Or are there any things that you would have changed about the legislation based on how you...
Yeah, there are several things. I think the most important one I would change is that in an effort to get votes from legislative districts outside of Marion County, we put a cap on the addition of territory to Indianapolis. In other words, you could not annex. And the result of that was we had done that because we thought that we couldn't get any votes from these legislators in the counties around Marion County if we didn't do that.
Yeah.
Well, what happened was none of them voted for it anyway. Not a single vote came from those people. But that is still in the legislation. And I certainly wouldn't do it again if we could avoid it. It ended up being one of the reasons given by Judge Hugh Dillon for the school busing decision in Indianapolis when the thousands of black students were bused to suburban school districts in an effort to fulfill an equitable and equal education after Brown versus Board of Education. And I guess it also was well, you talked about negatives. You said what I'd leave out. The first one is the anti-annexation clause. The second thing that I think is clear here, and this group of people who worked at the Burkhardt House. We were all white males. There were no women at that meeting, although we had a number of women in our delegation.
Right.
There were no African Americans, although we had African Americans in our delegation, including Harriet Bailey Kahn, who had served as the she's a lawyer. I can't remember her exact title then, but anyway, and Coach Ray Crow from the Crispus Attucks famous basketball team. Unigov at that time was actually endorsed by the Recorder, the black newspaper in Indianapolis. We saw it as granting the African American community almost guaranteed districts in which the representatives would be African Americans, and that's what happened. There are those who criticize the legislation because it moved the vote for mayor from the old city boundaries to the county boundaries, and they maintain that made it impossible for a black man or woman to be elected mayor. That may or may not be true. That was not our intention. It was not a, quote, power grab on our part, but it's been interpreted that way by critics who have written about Unigov.
Right.
So that's one of the issues that is still there. But now that you've got a dominant African-American population in Indianapolis, we still haven't had a black mayor. We undoubtedly will have one of these days. I think that'd be a great thing. I don't see any problem with it. But that was one of the things that was considered. That you have to realize that back in those days, the African Americans didn't have many institutions that they ran.
Right.
The major institution they ran was their church. And they particularly had strong emotional feelings about that. They thought ultimately they ought to have a black school superintendent, which of course they've had now. They thought they could have a black mayor, which they haven't had. Those are criticisms that linger today, and since we're now, as we talk, in the 50th anniversary of Unigov, will be debated and discussed in the next several months.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I want to go back in time a little bit to right before you were elected to the General Assembly. A little bit more. Do you remember who your main opponent was at the time?
Well, you see, we were elected at large from Marion
Okay.
County. And so it was 15 of us against 15 of them.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, it was kind of just two groups against each other, not
Yeah.
one-on-one. Okay.
Right.
So what was it like your first election day? How did you feel?
Well, I was responsible for organizing Lawrence Township, which is, one of the 9 townships in Marion County. And so my responsibility in the election was to get out the Republican vote in that township. And so I was busy every minute of election day working with precinct committeemen and volunteers to get the vote out.
Yeah.
And obviously we were exhilarated at the end of the day. We won a magnificent victory.
Yeah.
There, as I recall, there wasn't any one of the legislative candidates who was less than 30,000 ahead of their closest opponent.
Wow. Yeah, that's impressive. So, how did your feelings change with each election, if at all?
Well, of course, if you're in the election yourself, it's the greatest, most important election in the history of your life. Every time you go through a new one,
Yeah.
That's what everybody says. But I would have to say that my feelings about this over the years, each time election day comes around, I still have that feeling in my stomach of doubt about how it's going to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you don't win all the elections. I was elected twice as the lieutenant governor of Indiana with Bob Orr, who was the governor. And then, of course, I lost an election to Evan Bayh in 1988 for governor. Pretty close election, but as they laughingly say, that close doesn't count. And so that kind of emotional roller coaster is always there on elections. It'll be there this year when I'm an outspoken opponent of Donald Trump. I'm a lifelong Republican. I've never voted for a Democrat for president until 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And I saw Donald Trump, and still do, as a disaster for the Republican Party and a disaster for the country. And so I have publicly made my support clear for Joe Biden, not because Joe Biden and I agree on lots of things, but rather I think we need to rid the country of this threat to an authoritarian presidency.
Yeah.
And I'm as I said a long time ago in this interview, my father was the first to point out to me that Adolf Hitler got elected to office and then became the authoritarian dictator that he later became. And we're on the brink of that happening, in my opinion, here in Indiana, not Indiana, in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as we speak here, the polling results show that the likely winner is Biden, but of course I was told that 4 years ago, and it didn't turn out that way. So
right.
I have the same feeling of trepidation, even though I'm not on the ballot.
Yeah, and that's something also I did see articles talking about you endorsing Biden about a month ago, and I think that's an interesting thing to talk about because you've obviously been a big figure in Indiana Republican politics. How has the party changed, do you think, over time from your period when you were, very influential to today?
Well, it's changed in a lot of ways, but I want to start out by saying I'm not leaving the Republican Party.
Right, of course. Yeah.
I still supported Eric Holcomb for governor and the majority of the Republican candidates, but it's the presidency that worries me. And the presidency has become an imperial presidency with enormous power centered in that office, and I'm concerned about it.
Yeah.
And I think thoughtful Republicans should be concerned about it. Now, how's the party changed? Well, during this time period, we have seen, through demographic changes and economic changes, a growing disaffection of what used to be middle America, who saw the American dream, in a sense, slipping away from them. And they reacted by becoming more conservative. The Tea Party movement and others like it grew out of this. Unfortunately, attached to that Tea Party movement is an underlying racial prejudice. And it's a sad situation, but this country is a country of immigrants. My ancestors were all immigrants, as were most, except those who have Native American ancestors. And the whole point I make is that the thing that makes this country unique among others has always been its welcoming attitude about people coming from other parts of the world to bring their talents here. So, from my viewpoint, the party has changed. There's a meaningful portion of the party that opposes this idea of the great melting pot, which we celebrated all the time I was in school. Pictures of Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty and all that sort of thing being part of the heritage of this country. And I think we're turning our back on that. Now, the growth of the Tea Party and this ultra-conservative movement, which also had as its underbelly a strong involvement in social issues, the abortion issue being the number one, the second one being same-sex marriage, and then all the legislation and attitudes dealing with LGBT people. And again, the party has moved farther to the right, at least in part. And of course, I've always considered myself kind of in the middle of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I guess I may be on the left side of the middle because of what's occurred. But Republicans always had determined that you don't win elections by being a radical. You win elections by being in the middle and being acceptable to both sides and to employing a kind of careful reasoning about what you do. We're talking here about a system in which we have what's called a representative democracy. This means we don't put things up for a yes-no vote. We trust elected representatives to make decisions for us. And our goal ought to be to elect the most reasonable and thoughtful people possible to make those decisions. Now, that's the Mutz philosophy. Clearly, the new Republican Party is trying to elect people who will make an iron commitment against abortion or in favor of certain kinds of Supreme Court nominees and a whole variety of questions. They also want to legislate a number of things that deal with the personal lives of individuals, which I disagree with. So that's part and parcel of changes within the party. If Trump loses, I think the battle for the soul of the Republican Party is going to be something to behold.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know how it's going to roll out or how it's going to end up, but I think it's one of the important things that will come. Yeah,
that's definitely another big question is, what are the ramifications of that if he loses? And I know some people talk about, like, okay, is there a possibility for a third party to develop as a result of that sort of infighting or not? I guess it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, but you're right, and we don't know how that's going to work out. In a sense, there is a third party already. It is the arch-conservative wing of the Republican Party.
Yeah, okay.
It's what Donald Trump calls his base.
Yeah.
But I do not believe that's a healthy thing for a two-party system. I go back to those days at the dining room table with my father. He said, one of the checks and balances that we don't write about much because it's not in the Constitution, but it is the two-party system. Mm-hmm. The two-party system essentially assures us that there's somebody with a vested interest watching the people in power. And he said that's a very healthy thing. And he said we need a viable two-party system in America. And then he said this is something that distinguishes it from most of the rest of the world, where it's not unusual for democracies to have multiple parties.
Yeah.
And those multiple parties represent different viewpoints on a variety of questions. We have had for years an umbrella approach to party politics, mm-hmm. where the people are welcome under the umbrella.
Yeah.
And I guess my view is that's important. But whether we can maintain that or not in the years ahead, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying. So, I mean, really, when you're talking about this and analyzing the situation, it sounds like, you're saying that, Trump and you are both Republicans, but there's different types of Republicans within the Republican Party.
Well, that's right. But see, Trump really isn't a Republican.
Okay. Guys, so that's what I was trying to get at, is like whether you thought he is a Republican or,
Trump is, quote, an opportunist. And I'm not opposed to taking advantage of opportunities, but
right.
He has mined effectively the emotions mm-hmm. of this disaffected portion of the population who have been joined by the Tea Party movement and a number of others who are in the social party movements mm-hmm. and social question movements. And he's put them together. That's how he won the election in 2016. It remains to be seen how that will play out in this current election. As I talked to you, we're just a week away, really a little over a week till the November 3rd election.
Yeah.
I have to believe that long-term interests of the country are better served by a more viable Republican Party, which emphasizes the quality of its candidates rather than the emotion of the issues it supports.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely another historic time to be alive. I mean, it's and
yes, that's right. You and I were talking earlier about the moment in which the Unigov was passed and IUPUI was created. Well, that was also the moment in U.S. history when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson decided not to run for another term as president because of his involvement in the Vietnam War, and it was the era also of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which was marred by gigantic riots and violence. So
yeah,
there were a lot of things going on at that time. That was a turning point. And again, as I said, our version of the turning point in Indianapolis was Unigov, which was a much different kind of reaction. But I think we're on another one of those turning points now.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely must be, really, really interesting, especially from your perspective, having seen so many things unfold in American history to now see the next turning point. I think that you would have a unique perspective on analyzing these things because you've already seen so many major turning points before.
Well, I don't know. I've been lucky to be alive 84 years and hope have a few more. And I guess I'd say that, yes, I have been fortunate. I saw the end of the Second World War. I saw the development of the Marshall Plan, which is an example of a victor actually putting the people they had defeated back in business again. It's a remarkable story. We rebuilt Europe, and we rebuilt Japan, and the result of that was that we also built an important marketplace for our goods and services. So that's a historic moment as well. And of course, the GI Bill, which came along, I mentioned that earlier, in which we revolutionized the availability of college educations to thousands. So that was a turning point. And then there are some others, but I think, of course, that the influence of the Supreme Court was another turning point that took place gradually over this period of time. And, as I look back at these decisions, Brown versus Board of Education, that, of course, involved the separate but equal doctrine. Other court cases that have come on since then, dealing, well, first of all, with abortion and a number of others, those are turning points, at least in how our society functions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So let's turning back to your political career. Now, you mentioned your first campaign was a group effort. Did you have any changes or to campaign strategies over your political career?
Well, I certainly had specific things I wanted to do all the way through my political career. Those varied, of course, as time went by. But early in my political career, the enactment a major research university for Indianapolis was TOPS, followed by Unigov, which became a major change. The development of venues for the arts and for athletics in Indianapolis became important. And then after I became a state office holder, I guess the biggest single thing I'll point out is the Japanese investment strategy.
Okay.
That, of course, occurred because I was lieutenant governor, and at that time, the lieutenant governor of Indiana was responsible for economic development. And so I had an extensive department of people who reported to me. Plus, I had the Employment Security Division, and the Division of Agriculture. So I had over 2,000 people who were involved in the parts of government that I supervised. And this was due to the fact that Governor Bob Orr wanted it that way. And he was pleased to include me as a partner in his approach. And there's never been a lieutenant governor any time in the history of America, I think, who had a better relationship with his governor than I did.
Okay.
So that was a really big deal for me. And what happened was that when we first took office, that is Bob and I, in 1980, Indiana and the country was in a really severe recession at that point. Unemployment was double digit. The interest rates were double digit, and the growth rate was declining. It was a tough time for Indiana because of our reliance on manufacturing. Our employees saw the Japanese, as we said in those days, eating our lunch. That is, they were invading the U.S. auto market and doing it quite successfully because they were making an automobile that people wanted. It was a smaller car, used less gas, all that sort of thing. Our auto manufacturers had a monopoly for so long. It isn't really monopoly, it's a duopoly would be the right term. And what they did was, of course, for years, just pass along price increases to consumers. And they passed along increased labor costs, which resulted from the dominant influence of the United Auto Workers in the auto. So here comes Japan without any union, with a lot of good designs and well-engineered engines, and they really became an important factor. So when I first took office, I said to my people, I said, we can't produce jobs for people. Government can't do that. We can employ a few people, but generally government does not create jobs. And so the question is, how do we give people hope? And so our first move was to encourage local communities to start what we call CDCs, Community Development Corporations. And these were a cooperative effort at the local level between the business community, the community, the political community, and the social service community, and to reassess what was good and bad about their communities, try to improve it, and then when they had a chance for new jobs, market to the community. Now, this, of course, gave people something to do during this period of anxiety. And in the meantime, then we said, well, where are we going to get prospects? And our conclusion was, after analyzing the international market, was that the best place was Japan, because the Japanese industrial complex had accumulated huge amounts of cash, was interested in expanding its market, and the biggest market available for automobiles at that time that they wanted was the U.S. market. So we opened offices of Indiana in Japan. We also opened offices in other parts in Europe as well. But the big effort was on Japan. And the history of that is now well known. When I first took office, we had 6 Japanese plants in Indiana. When I left office, we had over 60. And today we have over 130. Indiana is the leader among all the states on a per capita basis for Japanese investments, and is in number 2 behind only California in the actual number of investments. So our philosophy really worked. It was a gamble, to be sure, and it was a gamble for other reasons as well, and that is that we had just defeated Japan in a monumental war. And there are a number of people still alive at that point who remember that war and who hated the Japanese. And so the statement that was made was, well, they couldn't defeat us in the war, but they're going to take us over economically. Well, of course, that didn't happen because of the ingenuity and education system in the United States. But the point I make is that there were risks involved with that Japanese investment strategy.
Yeah.
The result has been that it worked out extremely well. Of course, our first really big success was the digital disc company that Sony put in Terre Haute. The biggest plum, however, was the Subaru Isuzu plant in Lafayette, Indiana, which was the first of the automobile assembly plants. After that time period came the Toyota plant in Princeton, Indiana, north of Evansville, and the Honda plant in Greensboro, Indiana. But we're the only state in the union that has 3 Japanese assembly plants. So that was a governmental goal that we developed as we worked along for 8 years.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Now, were there any protests at all against that ever? You mentioned that some people had anxieties about that.
Yeah, well, there wasn't a lot of opposition. As a matter of fact, most Hoosier communities, whether Democratic or Republican, were so eager to have jobs.
Yeah.
That they were willing to go along. Now, it became an issue when I ran for governor in 1988, and Evan Bayh used it rather well in recognizing the xenophobia of the time, and his campaign commercials, in a not so subtle way, condemned the Japanese involvement in Indiana cities. But I'd do it again. I think it was a factor in my loss of the governorship in 1988. But I'd do it again because I think we did the right thing. And history now is showing how much of the right thing we did. There are 64,000 people in Indiana, Hoosiers, who worked in Japanese plants.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big statement. So that's obviously that worked out.
Yes, it did.
So now, when you're in the Indiana General Assembly, what were you thinking as you walked into the State House your first day in office?
Well, I'd been there before because I'd been down to watch my mother-in-law.
Sure, okay.
House. I'd been there before. It wasn't as like having never been there before.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was very excited because I knew I was going to be sworn in that day, and we had absolutely swept the election in the previous year. It was a moment of exultation, but also a moment of challenge because now we had to figure out what to do with the power we had.
Yeah, definitely. Now, did you feel pretty comfortable with the legislative process right after the bat, or did you need some time to adjust?
Well, it did take some time to adjust because, of course, I'd not served there before. But I had a lot of experience in similar kinds of situations with bills going to committee hearings, and so forth through my student government days at Northwestern.
Yeah.
And that helped. I can't tell you that I was able to be a full-time on the ground running legislator that first year, but I learned quickly.
Yeah, okay. And what were some of the best methods for you in terms of learning the ins and outs of state politics?
Well, of course, the most important in and out was learning how to communicate with your fellow legislators.
Yeah.
Both Republican and Democratic. And I had a reputation for reaching across the aisle in those days. One of the legislators I worked with often was Senator Louis Mahern from Indianapolis. He was and is still a Democrat. And we collaborated on lots of things. I mean, an example would be we supported the legislation that created the White River State Park,
Yeah.
And that's an example of collaborative work. We also collaborated on a bill to raise the stipend for aid to dependent children, AFDC. And of course, my Republican friends said, well, how can you be for that? And I said, well, the amount of money they're getting is paltry. It is absolutely a crime to expect these people to live on that amount of money. And so I joined Louis on a bill to raise it. We didn't get it passed, but we finally got it passed a couple of years later.
Sure. Okay. And so, yeah, you mentioned that you had kind of a reputation for working across the aisle. Why was that? What made you feel that was, a way of doing business when, I was going through some old newspapers about your time in the General Assembly, and it was often they were talking about how you were kind of against the traditional strong-arm political tactics that were sometimes used. Why were you so open to working with the other side?
Well, because I saw votes for what I wanted to do.
Yeah, it's just
that's number one. But the second thing was that back in those days, our Democratic colleagues, many of them became close friends, social friends, people we had meals together, and we went out drinking beer together, all that sort of thing. And so you could argue vociferously on the floor of the Senate or the House over a specific bill, and then that night go out and have a beer with the person with whom you were having a debate. So that was common practice at that point. And there even were lobbyists who sponsored hotel rooms and other places in which they invited members of both parties to come and socialize. And that's largely gone.
When did you see that, I guess it was, I guess the question I want to ask is, you served until, I guess, 1980 in the General Assembly. Did you see over time there start to be some breaks in the ability to work together? Did it seem like it was becoming more polarized over time, or was that
Well, I think that was pretty much after the General Assembly. To be sure, the early beginnings of the ultra-conservative movement and the Tea Party and all that sort of thing was finding its way into the Republican Party, but I did not see the kind of animosity during my tenure in 13 years in the legislature, House and Senate, and even my 8 years as presiding officer of the Senate.
Yeah.
I mean, here I was every day with all these people. I knew every one of them pretty well. I knew their wives and so forth. It was easy to talk to them about things you cared about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's just changed quite a bit now with, Interesting. Do you remember the first bill that you sponsored?
First bill? Yes, I do. That's surprising. This bill will not be long remembered by anybody, but it was a bill that updated the sections of the Indiana statute to conform with internal revenue changes.
Okay.
In other words, every 2 years, back in those days, because we only met every 2 years, you had to update the Indiana code so that it corresponded to the federal code. The reason for this is, of course, that Indiana taxes, particularly the income tax, were largely based on the federal law, and then we applied a Indiana rate to the income. And so the first bill I passed was the updating of the Indiana code, and there were 5 sections to it. I can't tell you what they were now, but and nobody cares, I guess, except that it was done. That's the first bill.
Okay. And did you have any political mentors when you first got settled into the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, yes, I guess I did. Among them was W.W. Hill, who I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Another would be my mother-in-law.
Okay.
And a third one would clearly be, let's see, mentor. I had another one in mind. Well, I can't think of who the third one was, but there was one I was thinking about a minute ago. There were a few people in our delegation who had been in the legislature before. One of those was a senator from Hamilton County later, named Leslie Duvall.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Leslie Duvall was a conservative Republican. His father had been mayor of Indianapolis several decades before. And he was an example of somebody I relied on for questions concerning the criminal or civil code. I'm not a lawyer, and he was an expert. And so I was able to go to him and ask for advice on certain bills.
Yeah. That's useful, okay. Now, you served in the House and the Senate. What would you say are the differences between the members in the House and Senate, or were there no differences?
Well, there certainly are differences. But the fact that one's a 2-year term and one's a 4-year term just suggests that you have a little more time to get your feet on the ground in the Senate before you have to start worrying about a campaign for the next election.
Yeah. Did you find the process for creating a bill to be pretty straightforward? And
well, yes, I did. Of course, the old joke is that passing legislation is like making sausage. But the fact of the matter is that the process I understood, I knew how to work it, I think, and I found that in the legislature, the most important issue was always to tell the truth.
yeah,
Tell people you were dealing with what your motivation was, why you were doing it, etc. People eventually catch on.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that helped me the most. Now, of course, there were an occasional bill that became very emotional for one reason or another, but generally, the legislature does not act on a partisan basis on over 90% of the legislation.
okay,
It's that top 10% where the caucuses get involved and take a position on a certain question and so forth. Since my history in the legislature is one of budget making, I was often on the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the Senate Finance Committee in the Senate. In both houses, I participated in the details of the state budget, and I became kind of the go-to person in the caucus for questions about the budget.
yeah,
Everything from the school distribution formula to appropriations for building roads and highways.
yeah. I remember hearing a lot about that too. It sounds like, yeah, you were pretty influential in that aspect. Did you have a sense of how people would vote prior to actually voting on legislation?
Well, I certainly did, because you know most legislators count before they take a vote.
Yeah.
They want to know for sure what's going to happen, so they
Sure.
know how to deal with it. So, yeah, I learned how to count.
Yeah.
And that was particularly true in the committee process, because you had to get the bill out on the floor before you could pass it.
Right. How influential was party leadership during your time in the General Assembly?
Well, it was extremely important, and the caucuses, in a lot of ways, ruled with pretty much an iron hand. The way to be successful was to be influential in your caucus,
Okay.
so that you could depend on your fellow party members to support your approach. And then you asked about party leaders. L. Keith Bulen was a dominant party leader during a good deal of this time. And he, of course, behind the scenes supported Unigov, supported the IUPUI, University of Indianapolis idea. He seldom ever told me what to do. Only on occasion would there be an issue that he thought affected election outcome, and he might fill you in on his viewpoint. But I never had him pressure me or threaten me.
Okay. So you never really butted head much with party leadership or anything?
No, most of us, you really didn't have to, because you knew if you did things that they didn't like, they might not support you in the next primary.
Yeah.
In general, Keith and I had a great relationship. He respected my judgment, and I respected his.
Okay, sure. So here's kind of a different type of question for you. What would you say the public doesn't know about how the Indiana General Assembly operates?
Well, I think they lack information on how we make decisions. The fact that no legislator can be an expert on every issue, he has to go to somebody whose opinion he trusts. That's number one. Secondly, lobbyists perform a useful task in the legislature. Not because they represent a specific viewpoint, but because they represent a competing viewpoint.
Yeah.
So, for example, I often would get opinions from lobbyists on both sides of an issue and then take their viewpoints and compare them and decide, well, which one do I come down on?
Yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah, that's a good point, because I guess, it's pretty common for people to be, especially outside of politics, for people to think about lobbyists as very dangerous to the country and the state.
The third thing I'd add to that is they do not, most of them, understand how important the caucuses are.
Yeah.
To getting bills passed. And, of course, the caucuses, if you get a caucus viewpoint, can tell you how many votes you've got in that caucus. Every once in a while, we would have what they called a binding vote in a caucus, in which we asked the members to decide what they wanted to do and then get every member to pledge to support that viewpoint. The image is that this happens a lot. It may not happen more than 2 or 3 times in an entire session.
Okay, yeah. What would you say were the most controversial legislative issues during your time in the Assembly?
Well, clearly the abortion issue is one of those. That's a no-win issue.
Yeah.
You either got to be for it or against it, and you're better off to state your position early in the debate so you don't get tagged as a big participant in that.
Yeah.
Some people wanted to be a participant. That was not my goal.
Right.
So that had to be near the top. Another one in my time was the Equal Rights Amendment, which was an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would place in the Equal Rights section of the Constitution females. And, of course, you were in the process of amending the Constitution, which requires 3/4 of the states to pass a resolution in favor of it, and then it goes up to a referendum. That was a highly controversial piece of legislation. On the surface, how can you be against women having an equal opportunity? But there were a whole lot of arguments from the conservative side of the spectrum in opposition to it. So that was a controversial one.
Yeah.
Another controversy would be, as you see, most of these are social issues where the controversy arose. Every once in a while, there'd be controversy about the budget. And, as a budget maker, I learned how to create the number of votes I needed to pass the vote, which was one more than half. And you sometimes had to add things to the budget for a local legislator. That's a give and take sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. Now, when it came to the Equal Rights Amendment, I've talked to some other legislators and stuff who were also involved in that. What was your role in that debate?
I had no role at all.
Okay, just kind of, you were there. That was about it.
That's correct.
Okay. And in terms of the abortion debate, I guess, for people today who might listen to this interview, one thing that will be interesting is to think about, has the debate changed today versus what it was when you were in office?
Well, I guess my view of that is it hasn't changed much.
Okay.
It seems to me that we're still arguing about the same things.
Yeah.
The people against abortion are trying to make it more restrictive, and those who are for it are trying to eliminate the restrictions to a point. There's one area of almost total agreement now, and that is that it's okay in the case where the life of the mother is at stake.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the only place where there's much agreement.
Yeah.
As I said earlier, the abortion issue is a no-win issue for a legislator. The polls show now a majority of the population favoring abortion as a choice for women, a personal choice. But in any given district, it could be much closer than that.
Yeah, sure. What piece of legislation would you say was the most sort of complex to deal with in the General Assembly and took sort of the most time to figure out?
Well, I'd have to say that the Unigov legislation, the Consolidation of Marion County Government,
sure,
is enormously complex.
Yep.
It involves so many things, including constitutional questions about taxation and things of that kind. There are a lot of things there.
Yeah.
Now, the state budget was a major puzzle every 2 years, so you just counted on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. What was your proudest moment as a legislator?
My proudest moment? Well, that's a good question. I don't know I can say proud moment. I obviously was elated when we got Unigov passed. I kind of took some pride every session in a budget year when we got the budget passed. That was under Indiana Constitution. You're not supposed to run a deficit or a debt, and so getting those budget bills passed was a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Okay. What, in your opinion, is the most important work of the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, it's changed. When I first took office in the legislature in 1967, nobody paid much attention to economic development. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until later that suddenly economic development, even though it isn't contained in any of the burned statutes, became a responsibility for local government officials. Local mayors and county commissioners now consider economic development as a big deal, even though they don't have any in the statutes responsibility for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one of the things that was a dramatic change. The other dramatic change was the change in the influence of labor unions in Indiana. Mm. When I first took office, the UAW and the AFCIO were major factors in lobbying and opinion about what was going on.
Okay.
They no longer have that kind of prominence. The teachers' union is still pretty important, but its importance has dropped too, largely because of two things. One, the right to work law in Indiana, and the second one is that the only way now that local school corporations deal with unions in terms of dues is if they make it a part of the contract with the teachers, they agree to take so much out of each paycheck to support the union.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. But I guess the influence of labor unions has changed dramatically. The most important lobbies in the legislature are certainly education is at the top of the list. That includes the colleges and universities who are well represented and have really bright people doing their lobbying. And the second, of course, are the two teacher unions, the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, and the Indiana, I can't get it right. Anyway, the ISTA, Indiana State Teachers Association. And the other lobbyists who are fairly prominent are realtors, business community through the state chamber, and local chambers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. So now moving on to, I guess, some more specific questions about legislation, stuff you were involved with. Now, you served in the House from 1967 to 69, is that correct?
Well, I served for 2 terms, yes.
Yeah,
so
okay.
I participated in 2 legislative sessions,
Yep.
67 and 69, right.
And then in the Senate, it was from, what was it, 72 to 80?
Yes, that'd be right. See, I was elected to fill an unfilled seat when WW Hill became head of the Public Service Commission.
Okay.
So I was elected at the same time that Dick Lugar was elected mayor to his 2nd term.
Okay. But during the 71 session, you weren't in the General Assembly?
That's right.
Okay.
What it was, I ran for state treasurer in 1970.
Okay.
And lost. And so I was out of the legislature for that time.
Got it. Okay. Because I was going through the Senate and House journals, and I was wondering, like, where did you go?
That's where I went.
Okay. All right. So, doing some research, I saw a few different pieces of legislation that you sponsored, which probably are not well known. I don't even know if you would even remember them, but I just thought they were kind of interesting and would like to learn more about them. This bill actually passed. It was about establishing bilingual and bicultural programs in 1976.
Well, I don't remember much about the specific.
Yeah.
But I've always been a believer in international trade and I guess globalism.
Yeah.
And I saw that kind of instruction as getting Hoosiers acclimated and ready for the moment when we became a bigger participant in the international world.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought that was interesting because, from my personal experience, I've traveled around quite a bit, and I think one thing a lot of foreigners are surprised by is how many Americans don't speak a second language.
Yeah.
So I was interested to learn more about that, and that's cool.
Fact, that's interesting. I even won an award for that bill.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, from a Democratic U.S. Senator from Illinois.
Interesting.
It was for my support of intercultural understanding or something like that. I do remember that. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Okay. Now you talked about the development of White River State Park as being, something that you were big on. So were there any big pushback against developing that park, or?
The only pushback would be the anti-Marion County sentiment out in the state.
Okay.
And of course, there was some pushback from a racial standpoint because the park was located in a part of Indianapolis where a number of homes and businesses had to be removed, etc.
Okay.
So there was some of that. But of course, we and I saw it as an opportunity. We had the White River running through the middle of downtown Indianapolis. Nobody paid any attention to it. So we decided we ought to have a park on the banks of the White River, and that's what we did.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Another thing I saw was that you were a big proponent of state officials releasing full financial disclosures. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, that came from my early indoctrination in the legislature, in which we tried very hard to know what the economic interests were of each other, so that when we heard something from an individual legislator, we could see if they had a self-interest involved.
Yeah.
That's where it started. And then, of course, when I ran for state office, I released financial statements and so forth. Nobody seemed to care much because at that time I didn't have much of a net worth and much of an income. So,
Yeah, sure. Were there any other different types of sort of ethic-based legislation that you remember passing?
Well, we did do some changes in what you could accept from lobbyists and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay.
And that was part of what I call the revolution of 1969, 70, and 71, when Otis Bowen was the Speaker of the House. He was very active in the National Association of State Legislators. And they had an active view that legislatures could become more influential and have more respect if they were more transparent and responsible. And so out of that came the decision to move Indiana to annual terms of the legislature. One of the biggest deals was opening up the committee process. See, when I first served, a committee could hold a hearing on a bill, listen to everybody on both sides, and then they could empty the room, and in executive session could vote on the bill. So the public didn't have any idea how you voted. And so you could vote for a bill or against a bill in committee and then vote the opposite way when it came out on the floor.
Yeah.
And I found that to be an appalling set of circumstances. So, yeah, we supported those changes in rules. Those changes were all in the rules of the body rather than in legislation.
Okay. So what was the reason why you left the General Assembly?
Well, because I left to begin with to run for state treasurer, and then
Right.
I left another time in order to run for lieutenant governor.
Right. Got it. Okay. And looking back now, overall, how would you summarize your time as a state legislator?
Oh, well, this was great. It was great fun. It was a challenge every day to go down to the State House and interact with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle. It was an intellectual challenge and emotionally very satisfying, I'll say.
Okay. Do you have a favorite story or anecdote from your time as a legislator?
Oh, I could laughingly tell you, when I first got elected, one of the old wives' tales that they told to new legislators was that the lobbyists were always around, and that if you wanted a bottle of booze, just leave your locker unlocked, and the lobbyists would put a bottle in it. Well, I tried that one time, and what happened was whoever opened my locker stole my hat, but I never got a bottle of booze.
Oh my gosh. Did you ever get your hat back?
Nope.
Oh my gosh.
No, I never did, and it was an expensive hat back in those days.
Yikes. Okay. Wow. Jeez. What lessons, if any, did you learn from your experiences as legislator?
Well, the biggest lesson is that the world is full of a variety and different kinds of people. And sometimes you'd ask yourself, how did that person ever get elected?
Yeah.
And yet, once you got into it and began to analyze it and talk to them, you realized how they got elected. And
Yeah.
so it's a new appreciation for difference. I put it that way.
Yeah. Would you say that, generally speaking, most people in the General Assembly are pretty much just normal people that you could meet off the street? Is there anything that separates them from the general public, or?
Well, the main thing that separates them is you got to have drive and ambition.
Okay.
You don't get there.
Yeah.
And so that separates them. Intellectually, I found them to be, the legislature to be full of people from different levels of intelligence.
Okay.
You soon figured out who the really bright people were, and you learned to have a different kind of attitude about their opinions.
Yeah.
You also found out that there were people there who were motivated to be there by some really important challenges that they faced in their day-to-day living.
Yeah.
And that was an important challenge as well. There were farmers and doctors and lots of lawyers and so forth in the process. So you got to know these people. It is a very close relationship you have with legislators.
Right.
You sit with them daily. You are in committee meetings with them. You attended social events with them. May not be that way today, but it sure was true when I was there. So,
sure.
Some of the best friends I've ever had in this world were in the legislature. Don't know that I had vicious enemies in the legislature. There's certainly varying degrees of respect, but that's the way it is in the real world.
Yeah. Okay. Did you have any regrets as a legislature?
Yes. Yeah. I once gave a speech about that. There were 3 regrets that I can name. One is that I voted for the collective bargaining bill for teachers. That was a big mistake, and I did that at the behest of Otis Bowen when he was elected governor. He asked me to support it, and I did. Before he died, he even admitted to me that it was a big mistake.
Okay.
The second area I would suggest is, you may find this to be funny or strange, but I voted to eliminate a number of patronage programs.
Okay.
The largest one being the license branch system and the so-called 2% club, where individuals who were employed by state or local government were required to, and got their jobs on the recommendation of the political party, they were required to contribute 2% of their paycheck each pay period to the party in power. Now you're going to say, well, those were evils. You may not say that, but I would suggest to you that that method of paying for and financing political parties was far less invasive and threatening to society than is the big money programs that we deal with now.
Right.
That's Mutz's opinion. I wrote a column for the Indianapolis Business Journal about it. I wrote regular columns for about 8 years, and I remember writing one about that.
Yeah.
So you ask about mistakes. That'd be the second mistake. The third mistake I made is this, and you may think this is strange, but during my tenure as a budget maker, when we first got there in 1967, the universities and colleges got just one line item appropriation. That was for Indiana, Purdue, Ball State, Indiana State, and later on Ivy Tech. That money was in one line item, and the presidents of the 2 big campuses, Herman Wells in Bloomington and Fred Hovde in Lafayette, got together and decided which university got how much. Now, I said that was not transparent enough. We ought to have individual line item appropriations. And I still say that's the way it ought to be. However, I hadn't anticipated what was going to happen in the legislature when each location got specific amounts of money. Suddenly, the legislators from those parts of the state conditioned their support of the State Budget Act on getting something for their district.
Okay.
And that's a kind of log rolling that had not occurred to me. one of the reasons we have a proliferation of Ivy Tech campuses in Indiana is that you, in essence, satisfied a local legislator's need for a choice morsel to take home with him. And we ended up with too many campuses, too much overhead, and while the log rolling program is common to the legislative process, I didn't anticipate what an evil it might be.
Yeah.
So those are the three things I'd list.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a little bit about sort of money in politics. How has the role of money in politics changed in your estimation?
Well, the old line is money is the mother's milk of politics. And I guess I have to agree with that. It has a lot to do with your ability to get elected and to stay in office. Yes, the amounts of money in politics today are obscene. That's my opinion. The important thing about all that money, however, is that there be total transparency about where it came from and who got it. And unfortunately, with the complex system of financing political activity today, there's a huge amount of money that you can't trace back to where it came from.
Yeah.
And I think that's very unfortunate. As I said, the essence of this is not to curtail contributions, but rather to make sure that you can say for sure where it came from, who got the benefit of it.
Yeah. Okay.
And those are the kind of reforms that I'd like to see in that area.
What advice would you give to future legislators or even current legislators?
Learn to know your opponents, make friends with people on the other side of the aisle, and where possible, incorporate them into your decision making and preferences.
Okay. All right. So last few questions now. How has the state of Indiana changed over the course of your lifetime?
How has it changed? Well, when I first took office, it would be described as a swing state. And as it went Democratic and Republican in different elections. For the last several decades, it's become almost a universal, what we call red state, meaning it'll be Republican. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we were the first state to announce a plurality for Donald Trump. In other words, I think he will win the delegates from Indiana, that is the electors. So that's changed. Become more conservative and more Republican.
Yeah.
The other things that have changed is that the dominance of manufacturing, while we still are the most, we have to say with the largest percent of our economy in manufacturing, it's now roughly only about 25% of our employment. It used to be close to half. The importance of farming, relatively speaking, is about the same, except that what's happened is there are far fewer farms than there used to be. Consolidation has taken place there. The other major change is the importance of labor unions in Indiana has declined, and it appears will stay that way, although there are some signs that the organizing by labor unions will once again take a bigger role. I guess another thing I'd say is that Indiana had an absolute breakout period of time during the moments in which the veterans came back from Second World War. Higher education became more important. The general level of education improved. Today, we are, I won't say we're a backwater, but we're not a leader in terms of the percent of people who have college training and education, or even post-high school training of one kind or another.
Yeah.
And I'm hopeful. When I was the the chairman of the board of Lumina Foundation, we adopted this goal of tremendously increasing the percent of the population that has post-high school credentials. And we're making some progress, but we still got a long way to go.
Yeah, okay.
Those are the changes I'd list. What I've left out here. Well, the other thing, of course, is the influence of social issues in politics has but become more dominant than it was in the past. But
yeah, okay.
I guess those are the things I'd list. I mentioned the labor union decline. I mentioned the decline in the number of people who work in manufacturing. I talked about the consolidation of the farming community. I don't know what else I admit. I think those are the main. Well, I mentioned the change in the political parties. Yes.
Right. Okay. What, if any, enduring qualities do Hoosiers still have or hold dear?
Well, the use of the word enduring would suggest you're talking about positive things.
Well, you could say negative as well if you want.
All right. Well, I'll put it this way. In Indiana, we still are reluctant to argue and debate in person. That's very common on the East Coast and the West Coast. People scream and yell at each other about differences of opinion. In Indiana, that's not considered good manners in lots of cases. I think it's unfortunate. We need to get our political differences out on the table more. And the funny thing about this is it doesn't keep us from saying nasty things about other people behind their backs.
Right.
But it's unfortunate in my mind that we can't have a genuine difference of opinion and still like each other. And I think that's a real problem. I'm encountering that now. You may guess as to my decision to support the Democrat for president this year.
Yeah.
I have gotten some hate mail and things of that kind.
Yeah, I can imagine. It is pretty unfortunate just how personally everyone has to take every difference. Yeah. What do you want Hoosiers to know about their role in relation to the function of the Indiana General Assembly?
Well, there, of course, is a remarkable deficit in public knowledge about the process, who the people are, what they stand for, etc. There's a good deal of that at the federal level, too. It's more pronounced at the state level. So I guess where I am on this is that it takes time and effort to know what's going on. Informed citizens were part of the basic idea of the founding fathers, and yet the number of citizens who are really informed is relatively small as a percent of the population. So, anything can be done to increase the understanding of our system. See, I don't think Donald Trump understands checks and balances. Mm-hmm. If he did, he would have more respect for the legislative branch. I mean, that's part and parcel of what the founding fathers had in mind, was co-equal branches of government. And he just doesn't seem to get it in that respect.
Right.
And that is very important, in my opinion. If you read the Federalist Papers, which I have, there's a good deal of debate and discussion about the checks and balances, the role of the minority in a population and in a legislative body. Those concepts are very important. In other words, the founding fathers did not believe in mob rule. The closest they came to it were in the early populations that settled on the East Coast, and they set up what were called town meetings, and these were not entities that were enshrined in legislation, but they were meetings that took place in these communities where they actually made decisions about what they wanted to do. And when you think about it, it's kind of amazing that these people gathered together and voluntarily agreed to do how the vote came out. I mean, that's an amazing concept.
Yeah.
And so what we got now is a situation where often we're not satisfied with the outcome of the vote and decide we're going to do everything we can in our power to change it at the next election. Now, I understand that motivation, but I think the process is one in which compromise, the checks and balances, it seems to me, give us an outcome that's not too bad over the history of the country.
Right.
I say it can't be a really good politician unless you know how to compromise.
Yeah.
And so if I had to give advice, as you asked earlier, to the incoming legislator, it'd be reach out to your opponents, but also learn that the way you get things done is to compromise. I mean, I remember my first big legislative defeat. You could have called it the fact we didn't get the new university created for the city of Indianapolis. But what we did do was we forced the leadership of IU and Purdue to execute a merger so that IUPUI developed.
Yeah.
And of course, what happened was that they couldn't agree on what to call it. They insisted that each of their names ought to be in the title, which became funny because it's Indiana University and Purdue University at Indianapolis.
Yeah.
and the name was often jokingly referred to as Ooey Pooey. And I guess I'd have to say that disagreement is pretty typical. And of course, our goal was to call it the University of Indianapolis. And that was fine until Eugene Cease, the president of what is now the University of Indianapolis, which at that time was called Indiana Central, he changed the name and co-opted it or opted it out of the possibilities. So now the University of Indianapolis is a private university on the southern side of Indianapolis. But I guess what I'm saying there is that compromise gets things done. Being willing to take half or part of a loaf rather than no loaf is a better way to go.
Yeah. So when it comes to general Hoosiers of the public, would you say that too many of them are just kind of complacent to what's going on in government and just for whatever reason, don't want to be a part of it?
Well, people want to be a part of it when it affects their daily lives.
Okay.
That's to be expected. If you're a business person, you're aware of the fact that what the legislature does and the federal government does affects your business, and you better watch it and be concerned about it.
Yeah.
I'm always kind of amazed. If you look at history, first of all, you look at George Washington, and Washington said, every responsible citizen has a responsibility to be involved in government at one time or another. And Washington actually could have been elected as the emperor, or whatever you want to call it, of the United States, had he wanted to be, because he was so popular after the Revolution. But what did he do? He said, I've had enough. I'm going home to Mount Vernon and enjoy my estate, my farm, and my family. and that, of course, was a view of government that's far different we have today. Now, another good example of that was Booth Tarkington, maybe the foremost man of letters to come out of the state of Indiana, won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And he said, well, I'm an author, yes, but I'm also a citizen. Mm-hmm. And so volunteered to run for the legislature and actually served 1 term in the House.
Yeah.
Few people know that, but that's an example of being willing to step aside from your your ongoing career and your biggest accomplishment to take part in government.
Yeah.
There are other examples of this, but those two are, in my mind, the classics.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything that you want to mention that I didn't ask about?
No.
No.
That every reporter who's ever interviewed me has always asked that question at the end of the interview,
Yeah.
hoping that you may commit yourself to something you didn't know about. And I'm not worried about that with you, because this is a piece of history for the decades that follow. And I guess what I'd say to you is I'm grateful you decided to interview me, and it has been a wonderful journey for me. I've enjoyed each and every moment of it, and even my wife will say today she enjoyed each and every moment of it. So I don't have anything to ask.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, I mean, thank you so much for taking part in this project. It should be a useful tool for whoever wants to use in the future, and hopefully it can also serve as a tool to help get people maybe more interested in state politics. That's another goal of the project, is to try to find ways to utilize these interviews for maybe implementing them into school curriculum to study. And there was a lot of ideas that we're thinking about to try to help make the public a little bit more interested in state politics. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this. So.
Well, I appreciate that too. I have to say, my book, the Historical Society decided to publish it, for which I'm grateful, and it is history from 1960, essentially, to the present, as seen through my eyes.
Yeah.
And, so there's all the stuff I've told you, and a lot more are in it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, definitely something I'll be interested in checking out to learn more. So.
Okay, great.
All right. Well. Okay, perfect. I appreciate it. All right. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and take care. So.
Very nice talking to you.
All right. Bye-bye.